joined today by Spencer Levy, Head of Research for CBRE in the US. First of all, we'd like to formally welcome you to CBRE's Dublin office and thank you for agreeing to come to speak to us today about your views on trends in the United States and how this might affect the domestic economy here in Ireland and indeed for our real estate sector. I think, as you know, Ireland is a very small, open economy with very strong historical and economic links with the US. There are 800 Irish companies with offices in the US at the moment. And I suppose despite our size, Ireland was the 9th greatest sender of FDI into the US in 2017. In turn, there are over 700 American companies with bases in Ireland, employing more than 210,000 people. And to put that into perspective, that's 10% of the Irish workforce. With Ireland housing the European headquarters of many of these US firms, particularly tech firms, and over 40% of office take-up in Dublin each quarter coming from US companies, by virtue of us being such a small open economy, I think that you'll agree that Ireland is very susceptible to a slowdown in global trade. We're therefore very interested in trends in the US, not least tax reform, potential movements in interest rates, the impact of trade wars, etc. So could you give us a sense of how you think the US economy is performing right now?
Well, the US economy is performing well. GDP growth just came out last week, and we had about 2.3% in the first quarter, which sounds low, but actually exceeded expectations. We think it's going to go faster than that for the remainder of this year, in the high twos, hopefully getting to 3, but I don't think many people think we're going to quite get there. Next year as well is good, though I would suggest to you after that, most folks are expecting a little bit of a slowdown beyond that. I would say that the key change, other than the change in administration, of course, was their ability to implement the new tax law, which many people think is going to be stimulative. Some people think it's going to be too stimulative because it's late cycle. It's unusual to have this at this stage of the cycle. But from an Irish perspective, it certainly may have implications on the attractiveness of domiciling in the United States versus going to another business-friendly environment like Ireland for the tax advantage.
Okay. Although the ECB are unlikely to move interest rates anytime soon, the process of normalising interest rates has already started in the US. And I suppose against a backdrop of strong growth in the US economy, a strong labour market, etc., American interest rates are expected to rise from this point forward. What are you expecting will actually happen in terms of interest rate movements over the next 12 to 18 months, say? And what, if anything, will the new Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell do different to Janet Yellen, if anything? Well,
I'll start with a small joke if I can, because I've been predicting in every speech I've given for the last 7 years that interest rates will be 100 basis points higher next year than they are this year. I've been wrong 7 years in a row, but this year perhaps I'll be correct. What we expect to happen with the long end of the curve, longer term interest rates, 10 years, the 10-year Treasury, is that it's going to peak out at around 3%, which is where it is right now. Though there are shops like Goldman Sachs that believe it's going to get to 3.5%. And I think that's generally right, but I don't think it's going to go much beyond that because there are secular factors that are tamping down interest rates worldwide. These include a low cost of labor, basically cheap labor around the world, cheap money around the world. And then the third secular factor that people don't talk about much, but really may be the major driver, is innovation. Because technology advancement has happened so rapidly, we use less resources, certainly on a percentage growth basis, than we've done before, and that puts a downward pressure on interest rates. So even though many people are concerned about what I call the other I word, inflation, I think that interest rates aren't going to rise that quickly, much beyond that 3.5% level, because inflation has still been in check, particularly wage inflation, which one might expect to see more of given how low the unemployment rate is in the United States.
Okay. Well, taking that on board and assuming you're correct in terms of your predictions for interest rates, what implications does that have for the commercial real estate market in the US?
Well, in my mind, what's more important than the absolute number, the rate of interest, is the rate of rise if it happens too quickly. So what we saw from September through the beginning of January of this year was a very rapid rise in the long end of the curve. The 10-year Treasury moved by about 60, 70 basis points. And that caused a little concern in the marketplace. Didn't know where it was going to top out, but then we had a calming period for a few months, which I think helped stabilize confidence in the marketplace. What does it mean for commercial real estate? Well, Obviously, a higher cost of capital puts upward pressure on cap rates, and it's certainly going to put more upward pressure on cap rates in those markets that are at the mature phase of the cycle with slower income growth. Though I will say that some of those markets are markets like New York, San Francisco. Those are also markets that have a huge inflow of international capital. So even that is putting downward pressure on cap rates in the face of a weakening growth picture for NOI. So the areas that I think are going to see the most resiliency to rising interest rates are some of the higher growth secondary markets, markets like Nashville or Denver or Austin or Raleigh or Portland. But clearly interest rates rising put upward pressure on cap rates, and we expect modest rise this year, maybe a little bit more next year. When I say modest, 25 basis points is the ballpark, but maybe a little bit higher than that.
Okay. Something we've seen, I suppose, quite recently in the Irish market is this greater move towards alternative investments. So a lot of discussion around build to rent, PRS, and indeed a lot of appetite now for industrial logistics. Is that something that's unique to Ireland or Europe, or is that something that we're seeing globally?
Well, I just came back from a conference in Barcelona. It was called the Power of Three, a terrific conference. It was an industrial conference, or sheds as they call them here in the EU. I made a little joke there. I said, in the United States, sheds is where I put my lawnmower. Here they're an investment grade asset class. But the logistics or sheds or industrial sector has never been more popular, not just here in Europe, but in the United States, and we expect that to continue. We expect that to continue because it hits two basic trends. One trend everybody's aware of, which is the rise of e-commerce and the ability to have last mile distribution. The second trend is what I call local is the new global. What does that mean? We're seeing a rise in many local businesses being formed. I use the example of microbreweries as an example of a local business that's being formed, in part as a reaction to globalization and automation, a business that is more protected from those forces. So industrial will pick up both of those trends. And the third trend it could pick up is home building, because home building, if you are a contractor and you're building cabinetry or something else for your home, your staging area is typically light industrial. So light industrial is an area we're more bullish on at this stage of the cycle because the large warehouse distribution centers, which are terrific, have just been priced to perfection.
Okay. I know you travel extensively throughout the United States. What cities or locations in particular you think are doing particularly well at the moment, and are there any lessons for Ireland or indeed Dublin from what you've seen? Sure.
So I point to the same factors to take a market from the third or second tier to the tier above that. And it's the same factors in every market. One is the inflow of foreign capital. Second is creating your own talent base through the university system. And third is creating a live, work, play environment where people want to come there just because it's a great place to live, work, and play. And so some of the markets that are doing a terrific job of that include markets like Nashville, Denver, Salt Lake City, but even some markets like Phoenix, Arizona. And I'll use a great example of Arizona State University. Because Arizona State University, when I was a kid, was known for football and fun. You know what they did? They said, you know what, all these smart young folks are leaving Arizona. Why don't we keep them here? Where they created an honors program at Arizona State, and they have now created the single best sub-market in Arizona, which is Tempe, Arizona. And it's because it's right near Arizona State. But that same trend of having the great sub-market near universities replicates itself all over the United States. In Pittsburgh, between Carnegie Mellon and Pitt. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, near University of Michigan. In Philadelphia, near Drexel University. This trend of innovating near the universities, creating a live, work, play environment are the keys to success. The last thing I would mention that's a key to success is infrastructure, certain types of infrastructure. I read some of your reports earlier about the number of flights coming in to Dublin from Germany. Get more of them. It is incredibly important, not only for the movement of people, not just for tourism, but for business, but also for the movement of goods. Because last year, 85% of all goods in the world were shipped via boat. 3% of all goods were shipped via airplane, but 90% of the value of all goods were shipped via airplane. Improve access to your airport is going to go a long way.
I totally agree. You mentioned having spent some time in Europe last week, Frankfurt, Barcelona, London, etc. How would you think the European economy and indeed the real estate sector is performing right now, or have your perceptions changed having visited some of these cities in the last week?
Well, first of all, I just want to say everybody has been incredibly gracious to me here on this trip, and in particular, you and your Irish teammates just treated me great. So that may have shaded my opinion, but I was bullish on Europe before. And the reason why I'm bullish from an economic perspective is that you're still earlier in the cycle than the United States. The United States ran ahead of Europe in the recovery, and so because of that, Europe has a better growth trajectory for rents than does the United States over the next several years across the four of the five major asset classes. So I would suggest to you that from just a pure economic perspective, that's looking good. Your GDP growth is looking very strong. And I would suggest to you that they have other factors here, such as Dublin has some of the best demographics in the EU. So it's easy for me to paint a broad EU picture. Where I really go are to those cities and those markets that have these high growth characteristics in rent, having strong demographics, good infrastructure. But overall, I think the European picture is stronger than the United States in the intermediate term, simply because it's earlier in the cycle.
So does that suggest in turn that we'll have a lot of US investment continuing to focus on opportunities in Europe over the next 12 months?
Oh, no doubt about it. The percentage of foreign investment in Europe is more than double the percentage of foreign investment in the United States. It's about 40% in Europe. It's about 15 to 20% in the United States. And I would expect that to increase because we do believe the short-term, intermediate-term opportunities are better. So countries like Spain, as an example, that really got hit hard during the global financial crisis, cap rates have already compressed to levels that were similar to what we had seen before. Same thing in Dublin, but the capital values might not have, because we had such a downturn in the global financial crisis. So I think that we're going to see greater bounce back. We've already seen that in these markets today. So you're going to see more capital coming this way for sure.
President Trump wants to make America great again. We were all aware of that saying, but in doing so, is there a danger that he's going to make other economies, such as Ireland, less great? Ireland's low tax strategy, and in particular our 12.5% corporation tax, have been a key factor in attracting huge volumes of foreign direct investment into Ireland over recent years. To what extent, if any, do you think that tax policy changes in the US recently might weaken the advantage for US companies wanting to locate in Ireland?
Well, certainly companies, what they call it in the United States from the U.S. perspective is called a tax inversion, where there'll be a merger of a U.S. company with a company domiciled in Ireland or another lower tax area so they can get the advantage of the lower corporate tax. Clearly, that's the one area that will be negative for Ireland and other countries with low taxes, because the relative cost of doing business in the U.S. just got lower, not only because of the lower corporate tax, but also because of the lower cost of repatriating money back to the United States. So it was really two things, both the domiciled corporations and then the cost of bringing the money back. So that's a negative. But I will say this, a strong United States is good for everybody, because as you mentioned earlier in this interview, Ireland is one of the biggest exporters to the United States, so strong consumers there will benefit the U.S. So I would suggest, while everything is on balance good from the tax plan from a U.S. perspective because of growth, there may be some short-term issues as it relates to what we talked about corporations' decisions on where to domicile.
Okay. We've just come through what has been another critical week in terms of Brexit negotiations, and indeed Michael Barnier is in Ireland today, and the negotiations continue. Is Brexit getting much airtime in the US, and do you think there's a good understanding of the Irish border issue? Because it's number one in our minds, but I wonder if it's as obvious in the US, or has it been talked about at all?
Well, it's been talked about a lot, and I think the macro comment I would give is this, and I'm going to give the micro comment as it relates to Ireland. The Brexit hasn't been as disruptive as we thought it was going to be. Most people had projected, or many economists have projected, a significant downturn in the UK economy. Didn't happen. Actually has performed relatively well. But now we're getting close to the brass tack stage of actually having to decide what the Brexit is going to look like. So I think there's more concern. So from the Irish perspective, I would note that I was just in Frankfurt. They are seeing an enormous inflow of banks expanding in Frankfurt, in part because of that. We would expect some of that here in Dublin, but I think you're going to see more of a tech inflow from these countries, because the Brexit, from a financial services perspective, may benefit Frankfurt. From tech may benefit here, because one of the key things for tech is the availability of talent, which is scarce. And since you're still going to be part of the EU, you'll have a greater ability to have this talent here. I saw some of the statistics that you put together on uptake in the office space, and it's largely tech related. As it relates to the Irish border issue, I've been reading a lot about it, and we certainly hope that's resolved in an amicable way. That's all I'll say about that.
Okay. I suppose just finally, you've spent the weekend in Dublin and hopefully had a good time in the city. What are your impressions of the city? What do you think we're doing well? And equally, what lessons do you think we need to learn in order to be able to prepare ourselves for the future?
Well, it's hard not to have a good time in Dublin. It's one of the great cities of the world, one of the fun cities in the world. And I say that not to be flip. I say that because that matters. Because when you go to a city like Austin, Texas, they have a terrific block, which is Dublin Light. Nashville has one. Seattle has one. All these cities have this combination of live, work, and play. That play aspect, very, very important. So Dublin is clearly doing that right from a tourism, but also from domestically people wanting to come here. Infrastructure. Last time I was in Ireland was 16 years ago. And when I was here, the roads, I would say, were not so good. It was very hard to get around. Now I drive around here, feels like most European cities. It's done a tremendous job on your roadways. You're doing that well. But the areas that I would focus on to take the country to the next level include improving the STEM graduation quality from your universities, and come into partnerships with large corporations to help enhance that process, because that to me is going to be the single biggest driver. So improve the number of graduates from those universities, number one. Number two, encourage foreign students to come here. I made the example earlier today that we just sold a suburban office building in Nashville, Tennessee to a high net worth group from Bahrain for $100 million. How did they find that building? Their kids went to school at Vanderbilt, which is a school in Nashville. Foreign students bring foreign money. They bring diversity, intellectually and for jobs. They bring all these good things. So encourage more foreign students, increase the amount of STEM graduates, increase partnerships with these companies, but also infrastructure. More direct flights into Dublin. Spend money at the airport. It is enormously important. I say this not negatively. It was very hard for me to get here from Frankfurt, and I was surprised. Got to fix that.
Thank you. So just to wrap up, thank you again for visiting our Dublin office.
Yeah.
Hopefully you'll be back before too long, and we will.
Hopefully it won't be another 16 years.
Another 16 years, exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.